Welcome to our podcast. Today we're diving deep into U.S. policy towards Africa in the post-Cold War era. We'll explore significant events, including the U.S. intervention in Somalia and the devastating genocide in Rwanda. It's a complex narrative filled with both hope and tragedy, and we're excited to unpack it with you.
Absolutely. The end of the Cold War in 1988 sparked initial optimism regarding peace and development across Africa. However, it led paradoxically to a marginalization of the continent by the United States. Very interestingly, this marked a shift in how the U.S. interacted with Africa, veering from a deep involvement to a more disengaged stance.
That's right. This new landscape meant that the U.S. could finally analyze conflicts in Africa outside of the traditional superpower competition framework. Instead of viewing these conflicts as a battleground for U.S. and Soviet interests, there was room for a thoughtful, nuanced approach.
But here's the twist. The withdrawal of both Soviet and American influence led to a reduction in interest in Africa, as resources were redirected towards Eastern Europe. It's almost as if the focus on one geopolitical theater made the African continent invisible.
Exactly. By the early 1990s, U.S. economic and military assistance saw a drop from $1.7 billion in 1996. The international community mostly approached Africa through a humanitarian lens, often limited to crisis responses rather than proactive engagement. It's like waiting for a disaster to strike before offering help, rather than preventing the disaster in the first place.
We also saw this disengagement illustrated by the events in Somalia. When the dictatorship of Siad Barre was overthrown in 1991, it triggered a bloody civil war. This became a humanitarian intervention test case for the post-Cold War era. But what began as a mission of mercy turned complicated fast.
That's a great point to highlight. In the beginning, there was success with the delivery of food to famine-stricken populations. However, as peacekeepers found themselves caught in conflict rather than acting as neutral humanitarian actors, the mission's dynamics shifted significantly.
It's a prime example of how humanitarian intentions can take a dangerous turn without proper operational understanding, or perhaps some might say, foresight. The iconic tragedy of the Black Hawk Down incident in October 1993, where American soldiers perished in Mogadishu, not only devastated U.S. public morale, but also fundamentally altered America's approach to foreign interventions.
Indeed, the psychological impact of images capturing American bodies being dragged through the streets reverberated throughout the nation. The U.S. withdrew from Somalia early in 1994, and in a grim twist, this episode became an emblem of failure for both the United States and the United Nations in Africa.
And this laid the groundwork for a period of wariness towards African engagement. The trauma of Somalia left policymakers cautious, reflecting a newfound restraint within the State Department and the White House regarding commitments on the continent. There was almost a policy paralysis, a hesitance to step in again, especially when the next crisis came knocking.
And that brings us to the horrific events of 1994 in Rwanda, where the genocide unfolded in stark contrast to the lessons learned or not learned from Somalia. It was an event that would become a haunting reminder of international inertia amidst mass atrocity.
Absolutely. The Rwandan genocide showcases one of the gravest failures of international response. The violence began on April 6, 1994, with the shooting down of the plane carrying the Hutu president, which ignited an organized campaign against the Tutsi minority. The scale of atrocity was shocking. By July of that year, an estimated 800,000 people had been killed, with millions more displaced.
It truly was horrendous. During this period, the pace of killings even exceeded that of the Holocaust when viewed on a per capita basis. Now, despite this horrifying scale of violence, the U.S. response was notably subdued.
Right. Leading up to the genocide, there was a deliberate minimization of the situation. For example, U.S. officials sidestepped the term genocide, a term that triggers legal obligations for intervention under international law. This terminology avoidance became a strategic wall of silence.
This wall veiled a tragic reality where even the UN Security Council, in a move supported by the U.S., began withdrawing peacekeepers just at the moment when their presence was needed most. They whittled the number of peacekeepers down from 2,500 to only 264, tremendously insufficient to tackle the mounting crisis.
And the certainly chilling Presidential Decision Directive 25 set stringent criteria for intervention that Rwanda clearly did not meet. Thus, the stage was set for tragic inaction at an unprecedented escalation of violence.
The debates surrounding this inaction have also produced rich discussions in the scholarly community. Some, like Alan Cooperman, have argued that the rapid pace of killings meant that U.S. officials lacked timely information to intervene.
However, many historians strongly argue against that narrative. They've pointed out that even a minimal intervention could have saved a predicted 75,000 lives, indicating that it wasn't ignorance, but rather something deeper and more disconcerting that shaped decision-making.
Exactly. There's a strong theory put forward which links the lack of response to domestic political pressures. After the trauma of Somalia, the American public was largely uninformed about Rwanda, with limited pressure for intervention.
This absence of pressure from constituents allowed policymakers to avoid entanglement in Africa, leading to paralysis in action and, ultimately, a tragic inaction. It reminds me of a poignant comment made by Senator Paul Simon, who argued that just 100 letters from constituents per House or Senate member could have changed the trajectory of response.
That really shows the power citizens wield through advocacy and communication. In hindsight, it's painful to recognize the potential lives saved through active engagement. And as we know, the acknowledgement didn't come until later, with President Clinton offering something of an admission during his 1998 visit to Africa, where he stated that the U.S. did not act quickly enough in Rwanda.
But notably, he stopped short of offering an explicit apology, framing it instead around future obligations for civilized nations to prevent genocide. It is a vivid reflection on how politics can influence public accountability.
What a complex and heart-wrenching narrative we've explored today. From the optimism at the end of the Cold War to humanitarian failures in Somalia and Rwanda, these events remind us of the deeply intertwined nature of international policy and human lives. They raise critical questions for us, even in today's geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, the recollections of this era invoke discussions not just on policy, but on empathy, moral responsibility, and the enduring impact of choices made or not made. If there's one takeaway from today, it's that the vigilance of citizens in advocating for global engagement can sway the tides of history.
What an insightful conversation. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us today. We hope this discussion empowers you to reflect critically on ongoing global dynamics and reinforces the importance of advocacy and awareness.
Indeed, until next time, stay informed and engaged. Your voices matter.